Now, staying in East Africa, the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia has introduced several reforms in the past few years, from politics to economics and now the banking and financial markets. Those reforms are tough and sensitive and has resulted in pushback in some areas by a few of the regions in the country. Today, Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous nation and the biggest economy in the East African region, is looking to see the impact of its recent reforms. Here's a recent interview with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Gideon Timotheos, on how Ethiopia is tackling the political, social challenges through sustainable solutions.
To understand where we are right now and the challenge we face, the conflicts that have occurred, it is very important to look at certain factors, including our history, our political culture, our demographic reality, and also the economic situation that we find ourselves in. So to start with our history, the process through which the Ethiopian state is formed is rather unique in the African continent. In most parts of the world, states are formed through conflict, through violence, through blood and steel. That doesn't make Ethiopia unique, but what makes Ethiopia unique, particularly in the African context, is the fact that the state formation was led by indigenous native forces. The main protagonists in this process are Ethiopian. But if you look at the history of most African countries, the state formation was, it was an outcome of colonial conquest and the involvement of European actors is quite significant. So we have a state formation process that was led by local political forces, and we didn't have an opportunity to strengthen or to cement that state formation process through a social contract. And we didn't have an opportunity to heal the wounds and contradictions that have arisen out of the state formation process. So the legitimacy of the state was questioned and contested by some. So we have that background to grapple with.
This contestation has been occurring throughout the formation of the state.
Yeah, and it has been exacerbated by subsequent events. So there were some who were challenging the very legitimacy of the state that has come into existence, the modern Ethiopian state. Some have contested and challenged its nature, its vision, its identity, the narratives. Some have found it difficult to accept the institutions and its configurations. So there has always been this basic contradiction that has arisen out of the state formation process, and we have not squarely dealt with it in a manner that would engender consensus among critical actors. Another layer that we have to look into is the fact that we have a very violent and autocratic political culture. So whenever there are either be contestation for power or political differences about policy, about institutional arrangement, more often than not, the instrument of solving these differences has been conflict. So imposing your will, your vision on everybody else through violence, through the use of force, has been how we have done business for generations. And once you have secured power, once you have assumed the highest office, using autocratic means to consolidate power, that has been our practice. And through this process, not just through the state formation process, but through this autocratic and violent exercise of power, there have been many wounds and grievances and violations. And we have not also been able to address those in a way that is satisfactory to most Ethiopians. So we have this contradiction, we have this background. And on top of this, in an attempt to resolve some of these problems, The solutions and prescriptions that have been introduced, at times they have been very divisive. They have emphasized differences, divisions at the expense of what unites us, what binds us. So our politics has increasingly become polarized and ethnicized. And that is also something to take into account.
Let's fast forward a little bit to 2018, because 2018 saw a turning point in terms of this culture, this violent political culture that you mentioned, which is we saw a peaceful transition of power, unlike any time that we've seen in our modern history. Nevertheless, these violent political contestations have also continued, and we are seeing the manifestations of these inherited challenges that you said. Elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, yes, there was a peaceful transfer of power in 2018, but that event, that episode, couldn't, in and of itself, overcome centuries and generations worth of history and entrenched political culture. Right? So when that transfer of power occurred and when a new political dispensation was introduced, there are those who are very unhappy about that, who didn't accept the new dispensation, who thought...
Change in the status quo?
Yeah, who thought they could reverse this change, who wanted to return to the status quo. There are also those who wanted there to be change, but who wanted the change and transition to go in a particular direction. They had their own vision of what the change should look like. And for both sides, for both actors, instead of solving these differences through dialogue and political discourse, our default position, what drives us, the political culture that informs our behavior, is one that would privilege violence over dialogue. Most political actors do not have the patience, do not have the practice or the sensibility for that kind of engagement. Violence looks like a shortcut. It's what we are used to. Within the political class, there isn't this conviction or principle that violence is unacceptable to resolve political differences. So not everyone would say that, we have had this transition, let's build on it, let's consolidate it. The contradictions I have mentioned earlier, reinforced by that political culture. The inertia is against democratic, peaceful politics.
As some of the root causes, you've identified contested historical narratives, somehow perpetuated or ethnicized as well, these historical narratives. You've also identified a political culture that is quite violent and has not updated itself with the times that we're in. And also political elites probably not having a common agenda to work towards, where a lot of the political elites in the past may have utilized differences instead of commonalities to bring the nation together as part of the state formation. What would you say is the role of overt and covert actors? Because some of the actors are overt, but then are there covert actors also at play in the current?
Sure. When you have this kind of internal divisions, polarization, there are those who want to exploit these divisions. Countries, actors that think that, who are of the view that their national interest is best served by having a weak Ethiopia, a divided Ethiopia, an Ethiopian state that is not capable of delivering on certain objectives, on certain projects. They would naturally try to exploit these divisions, to fuel them using various means. Some of them covert, some of them quite overt. So our divisions have made us quite vulnerable for this kind of sinister actors.
Okay, circling back to the root causes and what's transpired post-2018, what I want us to get a little bit into is the political liberalization that has occurred post-2018. Particularly within the first year, what we witnessed is really an opening up of the political space. Political actors that were in the prior regime brandished as terrorist organizations were allowed to come back in. A lot of political parties that were inactive were provided the space to engage. And in fact, the Prime Minister on multiple occasions over the past 6 years has had a lot of sessions that has engaged various political actors and constituencies. Would you say, still with this manifestation of violent political contestations, that the political liberalization may have been taken for granted or hijacked by some actors?
I would say that we have not responsibly and properly utilized the space created by the political liberalization. Political liberalization has offered an opportunity, a platform for political actors, parties, civil society, media to engage on civic matters, on public affairs in relative freedom and liberty. But that space has also been utilized by violent, militant extremist groups to drive their agenda, to use the democratic space to advance anti-democratic objectives and to use anti-democratic tactics as well. And I would say
in tandem with covert actors?
Sometimes they collude. There would be, tactically they would say that our interests are aligned. For the local actors, their objective might be some form of regime change, trying to challenge the government, trying to take over power. But for the external actors who are supporting them covertly, the objective is destabilizing the country, weakening the Ethiopian state, bringing about its dismemberment if possible. So there have been obvious collusions between these actors. And I would say that there have also been other countries, other societies in which initial liberalization has led to violent contestation, has contributed to the flourishing of extremist views and groups, because this is something that requires getting used to. We can't all become democrats overnight. You might change your laws, you might adapt new institutional arrangements, but developing the culture, the sensibility, the ethos for democratic discourse and politics, that takes time, that requires some form of democratic socialization. And, it's something that happens through generations and not overnight.
One of the things that I recall, particularly prior to 2018, and now because we're talking about democratization and liberalization of the political space and liberalization of expressions as well. And the internet has got a huge role in that sense. And what I recall prior to 2018 is I remember Ethiopia used to be one of the most expensive countries when it comes to accessing the internet. In Africa, it was probably one of the highest in terms of cost. But what we've seen through the liberalization of the digital space within Ethiopia is internet penetration has increased. Hence, a lot of people are now connected in various parts of the country as well, accessing or interacting with different segments of society within and across the world has become much easier as well. What I'm leading to is, because you mentioned earlier in terms of this perpetuation for narration of disintegration of a nation. And we see that at play a lot over social media. So I want us to get a little bit into your perspective on what is the role of social media, particularly in fueling violent conflicts and also perpetuating this narration of disintegration of a nation.
I would say that social media and generally the digital media platforms have played a significant role in worsening polarization and division. The polarization was already there. Clashing narratives were already there. A certain degree of animosity, antagonistic posture, ethnic and religious extremism, it was already there. And to some extent, it was even state-sponsored and institutionalized. But the fact that everyone now has, pretty much everyone has
information at their fingertips.
An opportunity to, the mechanism, the instruments to generate content and to propagate it, to disseminate it to millions, if not billions. Without any editorial oversight, without any restraint, that has made it quite easy for anyone with an extremist view to infect millions. And the algorithm of these social media platforms, their business model itself, it promotes divisive content, because the more controversial and divisive it is, the more
popular that you get.
The more reaction it would trigger. The more reaction it triggers, the way they see it, it's an engaging content. We'll get more viewers, we'll get more people engaged, hooked to this platform, so they are promoted. If you say something that is conciliatory, something that is intended to bring everyone together, that is boring, that's not engaging, so it's relegated in the feed. So I would say that social media platforms have fueled the division and fueled extremism, and that has been exhibited not only in Ethiopia, but in countries that were supposedly established democracies. You have a situation now where in countries that boast a democracy of 200 years or for centuries.
See a surge in right-wing extremism as well.
People saying, the election has been stolen. Our institutions are not fair. There is selective prosecution. So you see the legitimacy and credibility of institutions being eroded, even in established democracies, due to social media. And in a context like Ethiopia, where you don't have strong institutions, where you don't have a robust social contract, the negative effects of these media platforms is even more pronounced.
And many locally as well as internationally are becoming susceptible to conflict entrepreneurs. Digital conflict entrepreneurship, I would also say, is something that might be currently being perpetuated. Would that be something that you see being reflected here as well?
For the digital space and the ease with which you could disseminate any view, it has made it easier for conflict entrepreneurs to engage in their trade, to sow division, to sow chaos, and try to gain some political or economic benefit through their crisis.
Okay. So Dr. Gadio, let's get into a little bit of the most important part, which is what the government has been doing in addressing these instances of conflict and political violence. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, one thing among many things that he has been consistent about over the past 6 years is this call to armed actors even when the political space at the beginning was opening up and many of the reforms were taking place, bringing armed actors to come around the table and discuss the future of Ethiopia has been something that he has been championing from the beginning. Recently, on the 5th year anniversary of the formation of the Prosperity Party, he had also once again put a call to armed actors to put their arms down and come back around the negotiating table or the discussion table. What has the government been doing consistently over the past few years in addressing these instances of political contestation, violent contestation, and conflicts?
I think in relation to this, there are initiatives and efforts that the policy directions that we have to look into. Whenever violent actors, militant groups have tried to impose their will on the nation, on the people, one of the things that the government has tried to do is uphold law and order, demonstrate that this path doesn't lead anywhere, that it is unacceptable. So resisting these efforts, countering these efforts, taking law enforcement measures, containing this kind of militant campaigns, this has been something that has been done throughout the last 5 years.
But it also is tied to what you said prior, where we had weak institutions to enforce these kind of things. Clear, new way that we're moving towards addressing some of these issues is also strengthening institutions. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about the security sector?
So, and in order for law enforcement agencies, security agencies, to be able to discharge their constitutional mandate, their responsibility as stipulated in the law of the land. A lot of effort has been expended to strengthen these institutions, to make them more inclusive, to make them more modern and equipped to withstand the challenge of the 21st century. So because we have strengthened these institutions, today the state stands. Had it not been for the effort, for the reform effort in strengthening these institutions, in enhancing their capability, given the challenge we have faced, the Ethiopian state could have collapsed. But because a lot of effort there has been a lot of reform programs that have been implemented in these institutions, due to the heroism and patriotism of men and women in these institutions, and due to their enhanced capability as well, despite the multiple and overlapping challenges the Ethiopian state has faced, we have been able to resist this challenge, and we have overcome many of these challenges. There have been several efforts at the regional level or at a zonal level or at a federal level, attempts to get rid of this administration and install a new administrator, a new political group using violence, using force, and we have been able to foil these efforts using our law enforcement agencies by enforcing the law of the land. This has been a critical component, not only response, but one of the most critical and important initial responses. But there has always been a realization that law enforcement measures, trying to contain the violence, exercising and asserting the monopoly of violence that the state is legitimately entitled to, that doesn't give us the entire solution. We have tried to assert the monopoly that the government is entitled to over the coercive instruments of the state. We have insisted upon that principle, but we know that that's just half the equation. It doesn't really resolve the deeply rooted challenge and problems that I have alluded to earlier. So there has always been this openness to talk, to negotiate, to have dialogue.
And there's been several instances and attempts as well.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit more on those?
Many of those efforts have also been successful. So, for example, in the Benishangul Gumuz regional state, there are several armed actors, militant groups that were involved in conflict. The same has occurred in the Amara, Oromia, and Tigray regional states. There have also been pockets of instability in other regions of the country as well. And while upholding law, the law of the land, while trying to enforce the law using law enforcement agencies, using legitimate force, the government had also engaged with these actors, and there have been peace agreements, understandings with these groups, and in Benishangul Gumuz, recently in the Oromia regional state.
The faction of the Oromo Liberation Army as well.
And most notably in the northern part of the country with the TPLF. There have also been certain elements in the Amara regional state where regional governments or the federal government or even zonal administrators have concluded agreements with militant groups so that those who have raised up arms could return to normal civilian life. And there is a give and take here. The government provides them amnesty, an opportunity to engage in civil, democratic, political life.
Let's get into that detail because it leads me to one of the other questions, which is related to sustainably, closing this historical chapter of a cycle of violence. We have inherited a lot of historical baggage that has not been addressed through, decades and decades. And now we find ourselves at an opportune time when there's various processes that have been initiated by the government. Can you indicate what are some of these processes and initiatives that have been commenced over the past few years that are inevitably going to lead to sustainable peace?
I think in this regard, there are three processes that are very important and that are notable. Say the DDR process, a process for the disarmament, demobilization, and most importantly, the reintegration of those who have raised up arms. It's the intention of the government is not just to fight with militants, to vanquish them and get rid of our compatriots, our brothers and sisters. There is a preparedness, a willingness, an openness for them to, and an institutionalized mechanism for them to be reintegrated into civilian life. There are programs for their rehabilitation,